The Sith Empire is one of the most sprawling, contradictory, and genuinely fascinating civilizations ever written into the Star Wars universe, and this video is going to walk you through all of it. So before I get into this, I want to be upfront with you. I made this video because I think the Sith Empire gets shortchanged. Most coverage treats it as a backdrop for lightsaber fights, a villain factory, a reason for Jedi to exist. But when you actually sit down with the lore, the histories, the in-game texts, the codexes, the supplemental material, you find something much more complicated than that. You find an empire that had its own philosophers, its own internal wars, its own tragic figures, its own moments where it almost became something entirely different. That's what I wanted to capture here. One specific choice I made when putting this together, I leaned into the early Sith, the species, the original culture, the things that existed before the exiled Dark Jedi ever showed up. Most videos skip that part or cover it in 30 seconds. I gave it real space, because I think you can't understand what the Sith Empire became without understanding what it was built on. Alright, before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. Before the Empire, the Sith species and their ancient world. Long before anyone called it an empire, there was a people. The Sith were not always a philosophy or a title. They were a species, a civilization, a culture with its own traditions, its own understanding of the Force, and its own way of organizing society. To understand the Sith Empire, you have to start here, on Korriban, with the people who gave the whole thing its name. The Sith species were humanoid, but distinctly alien. Red-skinned, with facial tendrils called palpable and bone spurs, and a physiology that set them apart from baseline humans in ways that mattered culturally as much as biologically. They had developed in relative isolation on a world that the lore consistently describes as harsh, dry, and ancient. Korriban, also called Moraband in some sources, was not a welcoming planet. The environment shaped the culture, as environments tend to do. What the Sith species had was a natural and deeply ingrained connection to the dark side of the Force. This is one of the things that makes their story genuinely interesting, because they did not choose the dark side the way a human Jedi might fall. It was, according to the lore, woven into their biology, their instincts, their social structures. The dark side was not a corruption for the original Sith. It was simply the nature of things. Their society was organized around a rigid hierarchy with a figure called the Dark Lord at the top, though in the earliest periods, that title carried very different meaning than it would later. The earliest Sith Lords were priest-kings, rulers who combined temporal and spiritual authority in a way that made them functionally divine in the eyes of their people. The Force was not something you studied for the Sith. It was something you inherited, wielded, and demonstrated through dominance. Alchemy was central to Sith culture from the very beginning. The Sith species developed what the lore calls Sith alchemy, the manipulation of living things through Force-enhanced techniques, the creation of new creatures, the reshaping of matter and flesh in ways that look grotesque from the outside, but were regarded as a form of high artistry within their culture. Sith alchemists were some of the most respected figures in early Sith society. The tombs on Korriban are older than the Empire. This is something worth sitting with. The great valleys filled with elaborate burial structures, the temples cut into rock, the massive stone statues that loom over everything. These were not built by the Empire. They were built by the Sith species, by a civilization that existed for thousands of years before any of the events that most Star Wars fans would recognize. The valley that later becomes synonymous with dark side archaeology and Sith lordship was first a cultural and religious center for a people with their own rich interior life. The Sith species had a caste system. At the top were the Sith purebloods, those with the strongest Force connections, those whose bloodlines had been carefully cultivated over generations to preserve and enhance their connection to the dark side. Below them were other castes, priests, warriors, slaves. The slave caste is particularly interesting because it points towards something that becomes structurally important later. The Sith, even before outside influence, were a society that normalized hierarchy through subjugation. Their religion, if you can call it that, centered on entities they perceived in the Force, dark presences that the lore suggests were real in some fashion, not just mythology. The greatest of these was something they understood as the essence of the dark side itself. Sith religious ceremonies were elaborate, sometimes violent, and oriented around the idea that the dark side of the Force was not just a tool, but a living presence that demanded acknowledgement and, in some interpretations, worship. Warfare among the Sith species was not uncommon. The various lords and priest kings fought each other regularly, and the lore suggests that this internal conflict was not seen as a problem to be solved, but as a natural process through which the strongest rose and the weak were eliminated. Succession was frequently violent. The strongest claim to rulership was demonstrating that the previous ruler was no longer strong enough to hold the position. What we know about the Sith species culture before outside contact comes from fragmentary sources, and the lore is careful to present much of it as interpretation rather than established fact. Codexes from games like the Old Republic offer glimpses, but they acknowledge that much was lost, deliberately destroyed, or filtered through the perspective of later conquerors who had their own reasons to reshape the historical record. One consistent element across all the sources, though, is the Sith relationship with death. The Sith species did not fear death the way most cultures do. They feared weakness, they feared irrelevance, death in battle, death while powerful, death while demonstrating mastery of the Force. These were not tragedies for the early Sith. They were, in a sense, the final proof of a life lived according to Sith values. The practice of creating Force echoes, what later lore would call Sith spirits or Force ghosts of a dark side variety, has its roots in this culture. The early Sith believed that a sufficiently powerful lord could persist after death, that their will could linger in places they had claimed, in tombs, in artifacts, in the flesh of creatures they had shaped. This belief was not entirely wrong, as later events would demonstrate repeatedly. Their artifacts were not merely decorative. Sith alchemy produced objects that the lore consistently describes as genuinely dangerous, items that could corrupt, empower, or transform anyone who touched them without the proper knowledge and preparation. The Sith alchemists understood that objects could be infused with the Force in lasting ways, that a sword or a mask or a holocron could carry intention long after its creator was gone. The language of the Sith species, which later became the formal language of the Sith Empire's religious and philosophical texts, was ancient and complex. The lore suggests it was not just a communication system, but a technology of sorts, that certain words and phrases spoken in the old Sith tongue could function as focuses for dark side power, that the language itself had been developed partially as a ritual tool. This gives the later Sith tradition of speaking in archaic Sith its roots in something real rather than affectation. The geography of Korriban reinforced everything. The planet had a dark side nexus, a place where the Force itself was warped toward darkness, where the barrier between the living and whatever lay beyond it was thinner than elsewhere. The Sith species did not create this. They were born into it, shaped by it, and their entire culture was in some ways an adaptation to living in close proximity to a permanent and powerful expression of the dark side. Korriban's other significant feature was its tombs. The valley, now called the Valley of the Dark Lords, was built over thousands of years, and what the lore suggests is that the tombs were not just burial sites, they were power structures. A Sith Lord's tomb was meant to function as a continuing expression of that Lord's will and power, a place where their essence would persist, where their knowledge could be stored, where rivals would be forced to acknowledge that even in death, they still had to contend with this figure. The Sith Society also practiced a form of tribute through conquest, though in the early period this was limited to the planet itself and nearby regions. The Sith Lords raided each other's territories, demanded tribute from lesser lords, and absorbed defeated enemies into their own structures. The pattern of conquest and absorption that would define the Empire was already present in the species that preceded it. What the lore hints at, but never fully explains, is the question of how the Sith species understood their own connection to the broader galaxy. Did they know there were other worlds? The answer, according to certain sources, is yes, they did, eventually. There are suggestions that the Sith species had some form of space travel capability in the later period of their pre-contact history, that they were not entirely ignorant of the wider universe. But they were isolated enough that contact with the Republic and the Jedi Order was genuinely transformative when it came. The Sith Lord system in its original form was also different from what it became. The title of Dark Lord of the Sith, Darth Maul-era Sith, would barely recognize the early version of that hierarchy. Early Sith Dark Lords were not conquerors of galaxies, they were rulers of a world, powerful figures who commanded through both force ability and lineage. The ambition to project that power outward, to make the Sith something the entire galaxy would reckon with, that came later. Sith warriors in this period carried weapons that were not yet the iconic lightsabers of the later tradition. They used swords of Sith-crafted metal, weapons enhanced through alchemy to be harder, sharper, and capable of channeling the wielder's force ability. Some of these weapons, the lore suggests, had something approaching their own presence in the Force, not quite sentient, but not quite inert either. The tradition of the Sith sword would later be partially displaced by the lightsaber, but it never fully disappeared. The concept of the rule of two is completely absent from this period, and it's worth noting because so much popular understanding of the Sith gets coloured by Bane's doctrine backward through the timeline. The early Sith had thousands of Force users. They had an aristocracy of dark side practitioners. The idea that there should be only two Sith, master and apprentice, would have been completely foreign and likely incomprehensible to the early Sith species. Their power came from their numbers, their collective connection to the dark side, and their hierarchical organisation of that power. The political structure of early Sith civilization was more complicated than a simple monarchy. While there was a Dark Lord at the top, there were also councils, there were also lesser lords who held significant power in their own territories. There were religious figures who sometimes rivaled the temporal rulers in influence. The lore suggests that the early Sith Empire, as it developed into something that could be called an empire, was constantly negotiating the tension between centralized Dark Lord authority and the competing interests of the aristocratic lords beneath them. Slavery was fundamental to Sith society from the beginning. The slave caste did the labor that made Sith civilization function. This is not treated as a dark aberration in the lore, but as a structural feature, something the Sith considered simply correct, part of the natural order in which strength ruled and weakness served. When contact with outside civilizations happened, the Sith's approach to slavery would become one of the most immediately visible differences in values. The Sith species also had a tradition of oral history that the lore suggests was extraordinarily long and detailed. Storytelling among the Sith was not just entertainment, it was how power was legitimized, how bloodlines were connected to legendary figures, how the deeds of great Sith Lords were preserved and transmitted. Some of this oral tradition was later transcribed, but most of it was lost. The cultural products of the Sith species are interesting because they complicate the simple narrative that the dark side produces only destruction. The Sith were builders. Korriban's temples and tombs represent a genuine architectural tradition, one that emphasized permanence, weight, and the expression of power through scale. The temples were designed to make the people inside them feels small in relation to the Force and to the Lords who had mastered it. Music, or what the lore describes as Sith ritual sound, also played a role. Certain ceremonies involved sustained chanting in the Sith language, and some sources suggest that the vibrations of specific Sith words in specific combinations had measurable effects in the Force. Whether this was real resonance or cultural belief is one of those things the lore deliberately leaves ambiguous. The Sith species' relationship to each other across generations was also shaped by the Force. Lore suggests that the strong Force sensitivity of the species meant they experienced emotion more intensely than most, that passion, anger, ambition, grief were all amplified by their connection to the dark side. This did not make them less capable of loyalty or love, but it made everything more volatile, more extreme, more difficult to contain within stable social structures. The first Dark Lords whose names have survived in the lore are figures from a period so ancient that much of what we know about them is more legend than history, even within the Star Wars universe. Names like Adas, who is sometimes called the Sithiari or Perfect Being, appear in sources that themselves acknowledge they are working from myth rather than confirmed record. Adas is said to have ruled for 300 years, which the lore connects to his exceptional Force ability, and to have repelled an invasion from a species called the Rakatan. The Rakatan, infinite empire, which the lore places as a galaxy-spanning power in an era predating the Republic by tens of thousands of years, was the first outside force to make contact with the Sith in a significant way. The encounter was not peaceful. The Rakata attempted conquest, and the lore suggests that this outside threat briefly united the Sith Lords in a way their own internal conflicts never had. Adas reportedly led the resistance, and while the Rakata were eventually repelled, the encounter cost Adas his life. After Adas, the Sith civilization fractured again, returning to its pattern of competing lords and internal conflict. The lore suggests that the period between the death of Adas and the arrival of the Dark Jedi exiles was characterized by cycles of unification under a strong Dark Lord followed by fragmentation when that Lord died without a successor strong enough to hold the structure together. This pattern, strong central authority followed by competitive fragmentation, is one of the structural features that defines Sith political history across virtually every era. It is not incidental. It follows logically from the values of Sith culture, where strength is the only legitimate basis for authority, which means that authority is always contingent on the current demonstration of strength, which means it is always vulnerable to a challenger who can demonstrate greater strength. The Sith also had a concept of destiny that the lore frames as connected to the dark side itself. The strongest Sith Lords were understood not just as powerful, but as chosen, as figures that the Force itself had elevated for purposes larger than any individual life. This belief would later be systematized into specific prophecy traditions, but in the early period it was more diffuse, more cultural. Korriban was not the only world with a Sith presence, though it was the most important one. Other worlds in the region later called Sith space had Sith populations, Sith cultural traditions, and in some cases their own Sith Lords. The lore places the heart of Sith civilization on Korriban, but acknowledges that it was never limited to a single world, even in the pre-Empire period. The question of what the Sith species would have become without outside contact is one the lore doesn't answer, and probably can't. By the time the Dark Jedi arrived, the Sith civilization was thousands of years old, internally complex, and already showing signs of the patterns that would define the Empire. Whether they would have eventually reached the wider galaxy on their own, and what that would have looked like, is one of Star Wars' great unanswered questions. What the lore does suggest is that the Sith species were not simply waiting to be conquered or shaped by outsiders. They had their own trajectory, their own internal momentum, their own debates about power and succession and the nature of the Force. The Dark Jedi who arrived changed that trajectory dramatically, But they did not create it from nothing. They found an ancient, sophisticated, and deeply rooted civilization. And what happened next was a meeting of two cultures, not just a takeover. The force sensitivity of the Sith species as a whole also meant that their world, especially Korriban, was permeated by force energy in ways that affected everything. Plants and animals on Korriban show signs of dark side influence in the lore, twisted, predatory, resilient in ways that suggest generations of exposure to concentrated dark side energy. The Sith did not just live in proximity to the dark side. They lived inside it, breathed it, were shaped by it at every level of existence. Their concept of the afterlife, or what persisted after death, was also different from what the Jedi tradition would later describe. The Sith did not believe in peaceful dissolution into the Force. They believed, or at least the most powerful among them believed, that strength of will and mastery of the dark side could allow persistence beyond physical death, and that this persistence was not gentle, but active, aware, and still hungry. The dark side spirits that haunt the tombs of Korriban in later lore are presented as genuinely real, and the Sith species created them first. The technological level of early Sith civilization was significant but different from what Republic technology looked like. Sith technology was frequently mixed with alchemy, so the line between a machine and a force-enhanced artifact was often blurry. Sith war beasts were partly biological and partly something that the lore struggles to categorize. Sith constructs, semi-intelligent beings created through alchemy, occupied a space between tool and creature. Their relationship with natural resources was also shaped by their use of alchemy. The Sith mined certain crystals that the lore associates with dark side power, precursors to what would later become the synthetic red crystals of Sith lightsabers. These crystals were used in everything from weapons to architecture to ritual objects. The dark red aesthetic that becomes synonymous with the Sith, red lightsabers, red robes, red-tinged everything, has its roots in this mineral and cultural tradition. By the time the Dark Jedi exiles arrived, the Sith species had been building, fighting, dying, and rebuilding for longer than the Galactic Republic had existed. They were not primitives waiting for enlightenment. They were an ancient power that had been shaped by forces both political and metaphysical into something genuinely formidable. What they lacked was not strength or knowledge or ambition. What they lacked was scale, the ability to project their power outward into a galaxy that did not yet know they existed. The exiled Dark Jedi would bring them that scale, and in exchange, the Sith species would give the Dark Jedi something arguably more valuable: a tradition, a language, a philosophical framework that would transform a group of fugitives into the founders of a civilization. The meeting point between these two cultures is where the Sith Empire, as most people understand it, actually begins, and it is both more complicated and more interesting than the simple story usually told about it. The Sith species that existed before the Empire were not perfect. They were hierarchical, violent, enslaving, and oriented around values that from most outside perspectives would look brutal. But they were also creative, persistent, philosophically engaged with the nature of the Force, and builders of things meant to last far longer than any individual life. Understanding them as a full culture, rather than a simple origin story, is the necessary foundation for everything that comes after. Because the empire they helped build carried their DNA in its bones, even centuries after their species had been largely absorbed and transformed. What you need to carry forward from this chapter is simple. The Sith Empire did not emerge from nothing. It was built on a foundation that was already ancient, already complex, and already oriented toward exactly the kind of civilization that the Empire would become. The Dark Jedi exiles did not create the Sith. They found them, joined them, and changed them, just as the Sith changed the Dark Jedi in return. Chapter 2. The exiled Dark Jedi and the birth of the first Sith Empire, around 6,900 years before the Battle of Yavin, a war happened within the Jedi Order that changed the galaxy in ways that nobody involved could have anticipated. What the lore calls the 100-Year Darkness was a conflict between Jedi who accepted the Order's teachings and a faction that had concluded the dark side was not just a temptation to be resisted, but a legitimate path of power worth pursuing. The losing side of that war was exiled from Republic space, cast out past the Outer Rim, and pointed toward the deep unknown. What they found there would define the next 4,000 years of galactic history. The exiles were not a small group of rogue students. The lore suggests they were accomplished, experienced, and in some cases brilliantly skilled Force users who had simply reached different conclusions about the nature of the Force than the Jedi Council was willing to tolerate. They had experimented with dark side techniques, had created dark side entities in ways that the Order condemned, and had tried to bring their peers along into what they saw as a more complete understanding of Force philosophy. They failed to convince the Order and lost the war that followed. Cast into exile, they travelled through regions of space that the Republic had not mapped or claimed. The journey must have been desperate. These were people who had been defeated, stripped of their institutional support, cut off from the community they had known. The lore does not dwell on the psychological texture of that journey, but it is worth imagining. Exiles who had been among the most powerful Force users in the galaxy, now wandering in the dark. When they arrived in Sith space and made contact with the Sith species, the encounter was, by all accounts in the lore, tense and potentially violent. The Sith species were not welcoming to strangers by default. But something happened. The Dark Jedi exiles demonstrated Force abilities that the Sith species recognized and respected. The exiles could do things that even the most powerful Sith Lords of the time found impressive, because whatever differences existed between Jedi and Sith training, the exiles had centuries of refined technique behind them. The lore suggests that the initial relationship between the Dark Jedi exiles and the Sith species was one in which the exiles were perceived as gods. Whether the exiles encouraged this perception deliberately, or simply found themselves elevated by cultural structures they did not fully understand, is ambiguous in the sources. What is clear is that rather than being destroyed, which was the fate of many outsiders in Sith space, the Dark Jedi were absorbed into Sith society at the highest levels. The first generation of exiles intermarried with Sith nobility. This was not purely a political arrangement in the lore's telling, though it certainly had political dimensions. The mixing of human Dark Jedi bloodlines with Sith species bloodlines produced offspring who combined the refined Force training of the exiles with the natural dark side connection of the Sith species. The lore presents these early generations of interbreeding as producing some extraordinarily powerful Force users, figures who would become the first true Sith Lords in the sense that the title would later carry. Among the exiles, one figure stands out above the others, the one the lore remembers as the first to take the title of Dark Lord of the Sith in the new tradition. The lore around this figure is complicated by the fact that multiple sources give slightly different accounts, and the Star Wars historical record within the universe acknowledges that the very earliest period of the Empire is poorly documented. What seems consistent is that one of the most powerful exiles established dominance over the others and over the native Sith Lords, and began organizing the combined civilization into something with real imperial ambition. The early Dark Lords faced an immediate structural problem that the lore returns to repeatedly. The Sith tradition of succession through strength meant that any Dark Lord who established themselves was immediately a target for every ambitious subordinate who thought they were strong enough to take the position. This was true of the original Sith species leaders, and it became true of the new hybrid empire almost immediately. The first Dark Lords of the Sith Empire spent enormous energy simply defending their position against internal challenges. One of the most significant contributions of the Dark Jedi exiles to Sith culture was the lightsaber. The Sith species had their own Force-imbued weapons, but the lightsaber, with its more refined construction and its capacity for precise channeling of Force energy, was new to them. The lore describes a period in which lightsaber construction techniques were combined with Sith alchemy, which eventually produced the red-bladed Sith lightsabers that became iconic. The bleeding of kyber crystals to make them red is a later development, but the cultural preference for red blades emerged here. The Sith library tradition also begins in this period. The exiles had knowledge, and they had the habit of recording it. The Sith species had oral traditions. The combination produced a written tradition that drew on both, recording Sith philosophy, Sith alchemy, Force techniques, and history in forms that could persist across generations. The first Sith holocrons were created in this era, objects that could store not just information, but something of the personality and Force presence of their creators. The treatment of the native Sith species during this period is one of the more complicated elements of the Empire's founding. The lore suggests that the exiles, whatever their intentions, essentially inserted themselves at the top of a social hierarchy and used that position to direct Sith society according to their own priorities. The native Sith Lords who accepted this arrangement were absorbed and elevated. Those who resisted were eliminated. Whether this constitutes conquest or a more complex form of cultural fusion depends on which aspect of the lore you emphasize. The construction of a genuine military during this period was significant. The early Sith Empire built warships, organized armies, and developed a command structure that could project force across multiple star systems. This is where the Sith go from being a planetary civilization to being an interstellar power. The military was organized around Force using commanders, Sith Lords, who directed conventional forces amplified by their own abilities, a pattern that would persist throughout the Empire's history. The philosophical synthesis that emerged in the early Empire is also worth examining. The Sith Code, which would become the foundational philosophical statement of the Sith tradition, took its final form during this period. It is a text that reads very differently depending on how you approach it. The Jedi would read it as a glorification of selfish passion and the rejection of all bonds. A more sympathetic reading suggests it is a philosophy of radical authenticity, a rejection of suppression and self-deception in favour of honest confrontation with one's own desires and fears. Whether you agree with either reading, the code itself is a product of the meeting between Dark Jedi philosophy and Sith tradition. Korriban was transformed during this period. The valley that had been a Sith burial ground became the most sacred site in the Empire. A place where new emperors were crowned, where the greatest lords were interred, and where young Sith came to prove themselves against the dark side energies and the spirits of those who had come before. The lore suggests that even in the early Empire, the tombs on Korriban were already ancient, and the new Empire was essentially layering its own tradition on top of something much older. The Empire expanded outward from Korriban and the surrounding Sith space systems in ways the lore describes as both military and cultural. Worlds were conquered and absorbed. New populations were brought into the imperial structure as subjects. The Empire's early expansion was relatively local by the standards of what it would eventually become, but it established the pattern: find, conquer, absorb, expand. The slave trade, which had been an internal feature of Sith society, expanded dramatically with the Empire's growth. New species and populations became slave labour. The lore describes the early Sith Empire's economy as substantially dependent on enslaved labour for everything from agriculture to construction to the most dangerous mining operations needed to produce war materials. The scale of this practice across the Empire's history is one of the darkest aspects of the civilization the lore presents. The question of what the Dark Jedi exiles were trying to build is not entirely clear in the lore, and this ambiguity is interesting. Were they trying to create a power that could challenge and defeat the Republic and the Jedi Order that had exiled them? Were they simply trying to survive and build something for themselves in the space they had found? Different figures in the early Empire seem to have had different answers, and the tension between revenge-oriented and purely empire-building orientations runs through the early period. The first generation of hybrid Sith, the children of the Dark Jedi exiles and the Sith species nobility, grew up in a culture that was already different from either of its parents. They had the dark side orientation of the Sith species and the philosophical and technical training of the exile tradition. But they were also something new, people who had grown up inside the Empire rather than being transplanted into it. The lore suggests that these first-generation hybrids were among the most powerful Force users of their era. One element of the early Empire that is often underemphasized is the role of non-Sith in its population and structure. The Empire was never exclusively Sith species or exclusively Force users. It had massive populations of ordinary people, workers, administrators, soldiers, merchants, who lived within the Empire's borders, and whose lives were shaped by Sith rule, without them having any direct connection to the Force. The relationship between Sith rulers and non-Sith subjects is a recurring element of the lore that gets less attention than it deserves. Sith temples began to be constructed on newly conquered worlds during this period. The lore describes these temples as serving multiple functions simultaneously. They were administrative centers, military garrisons, centers of Force study, and expressions of Sith cultural dominance. The temple-building program of the early Empire was both practical and ideological, a way of physically marking conquered space as Sith space. The relationship between the Dark Lord and the Council of Sith Lords below them was also established in this period. The early Dark Lords created structures that were supposed to mediate the constant competition for power that the Sith tradition encouraged. But the lore suggests that these structures were always imperfect, always vulnerable to the ambition they were designed to channel. Every Dark Lord had to balance genuine consultation with the lords beneath them against the need to maintain clear dominance. The earliest recorded conflicts within the early Empire were not external wars, but internal purges. Dark Lords who felt their position threatened did not wait for challengers to move openly. They struck preemptively, eliminating potential rivals before those rivals had consolidated enough power to be genuinely dangerous. The lore describes these early purges as politically effective but philosophically revealing, a demonstration that even at the Empire's foundation, the Sith political system was oriented toward destruction as much as construction. The economic infrastructure of the early Sith Empire is one of the most underexplored elements of the lore. Building and maintaining an interstellar empire requires not just military power and force ability, but ships, fuel, food, weapons, administration, and logistics. The early Empire built all of these things, drawing on Sith alchemy for some of it, on conventional technology for more of it, and on enslaved labor for the rest. The specific nature of early Sith technology is described in fragments across various sources, but a complete picture is difficult to assemble. What the lore does make clear is that the Sith Empire in its early period was a genuine civilization, not just a military force. It had cities, academies, libraries, temples, markets. It had art. Though art oriented toward power and dominance rather than beauty for its own sake. It had a legal system, though one organized around Sith values rather than any concept of equality. It was, in short, a functioning society with all the complexity that implies. The Sith species themselves, as the Empire developed, began to change. The constant interbreeding with human exiles, and later with other human populations, began to shift the demographic character of the Empire's ruling class. The pure Sith species became less numerically dominant, even as they remained culturally central. The lore describes Sith purebloods being increasingly rare over the centuries, even within the highest levels of imperial society. The early Empire also had its philosophers, and some of the most interesting fragments in the lore are the philosophical texts produced by Sith thinkers of this period. Some of these texts engage directly with the question of what the Sith actually believe, and what kind of civilization they are trying to build. They are not simple celebrations of power and cruelty. They engage, sometimes sophisticatedly, with questions about the nature of strength, the relationship between individual power and collective stability, and the metaphysics of the dark side. The Sith Academy system, which would later become a defining institution of the Empire, had its precursors in this early period. The Dark Jedi exiles had knowledge to transmit, and the tradition of masters training apprentices had to be organized at some scale to maintain the Empire's supply of force, using warriors and administrators. The early academies were probably less formalized than what later eras would produce, but the pattern was established. One of the most compelling aspects of the early Sith Empire, from a lore perspective, is the degree to which it was simultaneously building something and being built by the process. The structures created by the first Dark Lords were not planned in detail. They emerged from the interaction between the exiles' needs, the Sith species' existing culture, the demands of empire building, and the constant pressure of the dark side itself on everyone involved. The result was genuinely unpredictable. The lore also hints at early contact, or near contact, between the developing Sith Empire and the outer edges of the Galactic Republic. These early potential encounters did not result in war, but they established an awareness on both sides that something significant was developing in the deep regions beyond Republic space. The Republic, busy with its own internal politics, largely chose not to investigate. That choice would have enormous consequences. The treatment of Force-sensitive individuals captured in conquered territories is another complicated element. The early Empire did not always kill Force-sensitives from subject populations. Sometimes they absorbed them, trained them, brought them into Sith structures. The lore suggests that the Empire's approach to Force users was pragmatic rather than ideologically pure in the early period, though this would change as the Empire's culture became more rigid. The Sith Empire's relationship with the Force itself is presented in the lore as qualitatively different from the Jedi Order's relationship. The Jedi sought balance with the Force, saw themselves as its servants. The Sith sought mastery over the Force, saw it as a tool to be wielded and a power to be accumulated. This difference in orientation produced genuinely different traditions, different techniques, different strengths and weaknesses. Neither was simply wrong, according to some readings of the lore, but they were profoundly incompatible. The founding of the first Sith Empire on stable terms, with a recognizable political structure, a cultural tradition, a military, an economy, and a territorial claim that could be defended and expanded, is an achievement worth recognizing even for those who find the Sith's values repellent. The Dark Jedi exiles arrived as desperate fugitives. Within a few generations, they and their descendants had built one of the most formidable civilizations in galactic history. Whatever else you say about the Sith, they were not incompetent. The lore leaves many questions about this period unanswered, partly because of deliberate in-universe gaps in the historical record, and partly because the various Star Wars sources that cover this era are not always consistent with each other. The picture that emerges is necessarily incomplete, a reconstruction based on fragments rather than a comprehensive account. This is actually one of the things that makes early Sith Empire lore compelling. You are always working with partial information, always interpreting rather than simply reading. By the end of the formative period, the Sith Empire had established itself as something that could genuinely threaten the Galactic Republic. That threat would take centuries to materialize into open war, but the foundation was in place. The Empire had territory, military power, philosophical coherence of a sort, and the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of Sith tradition, combined with the refined Force techniques of the exiled Jedi. It was, in short, ready to step onto the galactic stage. The story of how it did that, and what happened when the Sith Empire and the Galactic Republic finally met in direct conflict, is the story of the Great Hyperspace War, one of the most catastrophic events in Star Wars lore. But before we get there, it is worth holding for a moment the image of what the Sith Empire was in this early period. A civilization born from exile and shaped by ancient darkness, building itself in the spaces between the known galaxy and the void, becoming something that nobody had imagined and that would prove impossible to fully destroy. The Dark Jedi, who had been cast out in defeat, had found, in their exile, not punishment, but opportunity. The Sith species that had flourished in isolation for thousands of years had found, in their unexpected visitors, not conquerors, but partners in a project larger than either could have managed alone. The fusion of these two traditions created something genuinely new. It was violent, hierarchical, oriented toward domination, and it would cause immeasurable suffering across thousands of years. But it was also, in its way, one of the most remarkable civilizations ever built in a galaxy far, far away. Chapter 3: The Great Hyperspace War and the Fall of the First Sith Empire. For thousands of years, the Sith Empire and the Galactic Republic existed in a kind of ignorant parallel, each unaware, or at least not fully aware, of the other's true scale. The Republic knew, in a vague way, that something dark lurked beyond the outer rim. The Sith Empire knew the Republic existed, but the gulf of space between them was enormous, and neither had taken the step that would collapse it. That step was taken in the end, not by a military commander or a political leader, but by two young men who got lost. The story of Gav and Jory Daragon, siblings and hyperspace traders operating out of the city of Sinagar on the planet Empress Teta, is one of the most human stories in the entire Sith Empire lore. They were not heroes in the conventional sense. They were struggling merchants, bad at their jobs, deeply in debt, making increasingly desperate decisions. In a last attempt to find a lucrative new trade route, they made a blind hyperspace jump and ended up exactly where no Republic citizen had ever gone, in the heart of Sith space, directly in front of the Sith Empire's military fleet. The timing could not have been worse. The Sith Empire in this period was in the middle of a succession crisis. The Dark Lord Marka Ragnos, one of the most powerful and respected Sith Lords in the Empire's history, had just died. Two major figures, Naga Sado and Ludo Kresh, were competing for the position of Dark Lord. The arrival of two strangers from Republic space landed the Daragons directly in the middle of this political crisis, because each side immediately tried to use the newcomers to their advantage. Ludo Kresh represented the isolationist faction within the Empire. His position was essentially that the Republic was too dangerous to engage, that the Sith should consolidate their existing power rather than risk a war they might not win. He saw the Daragons as spies sent to provoke exactly the kind of response that would benefit the Republic. His instinct, consistent with his general orientation, was to execute them and pretend this had never happened. Naga Sado was exactly the opposite. He saw the Daragons' arrival as the sign he had been waiting for, proof that the Republic was within reach, that the Sith Empire's centuries of preparation could now be put to use. Where Kresh saw danger, Sado saw opportunity. He freed the Daragons from captivity, helped Jory escape back to Republic space with a tracking device hidden on her ship, and used Gav as an inside source on Republic military dispositions. He then staged a fake Republic attack on the Sith to force the other Lords to support him, seized the Dark Lord position, and launched his invasion. The Great Hyperspace War began as Sado's fleet followed Jory's tracker back through hyperspace into Republic space. What he launched was not a small raid, but a genuine Imperial invasion. Multiple fleets striking multiple Republic worlds simultaneously, directed by Sado himself from a meditation sphere that allowed him to project force illusions on a massive scale to multiply the apparent size of his forces. The initial assaults devastated multiple worlds and threw the Republic into panic. The lore describes the early stages of the Great Hyperspace War as catastrophic for the Republic. Worlds like Koros Major and Kirik fell under Sith assault. The Jedi Order scrambled to respond. Republic military forces, unprepared for this kind of coordinated interstellar invasion, struggled to organize an effective response. For a brief period, the Sith seemed to be winning the war that Sado had always said they could win. But the war turned, and it turned in ways that the lore suggests were partly Sado's own fault. His use of Sith alchemy creatures as war beasts was effective but unpredictable. His Force illusions, while devastating, were vulnerable to Force-sensitive opponents who could see through them. Jedi Masters who managed to perceive the truth behind the illusions could disrupt Sado's entire command and control system. The Republic, once it stabilized enough to fight back, proved more resilient than Sado had anticipated. The role of Gav Daragon in the war's resolution is one of the more morally complex elements of the lore. Gav had been Sado's insider, his source on Republic vulnerabilities, complicit, even if not entirely willingly, in the invasion. But as the Sith assault rolled across Republic worlds, and he saw the actual consequences, the dead, the burning cities, the devastation of populations that had nothing to do with the political conflicts between empires, he turned on Sado. He provided Republic and Jedi forces with information about Sith fleet positions and tactics that proved decisive. Gav did not survive his defection. The lore records his death during the war, and it treats him with a certain ambiguity. He was not a hero in any simple sense. He had helped start the war. But his turn against Sado, at the cost of his own life, was the kind of moral reckoning that the lore takes seriously. His sister Jory, who had been the unwitting trigger for the whole catastrophe, survived and had to carry the weight of what her desperate hyperspace jump had unleashed. The Battle of Primus Golud, fought near a highly unstable red star, was one of the war's decisive engagements. Sado, recognizing that the tide had turned against him, used his Sith meditation sphere to trigger a solar flare that destroyed much of both fleets involved, Sith and Republic alike, covering his retreat. This action, sacrificing his own forces to escape, is characteristic of the Sado portrayed in the lore: brilliant, ruthless, willing to destroy anything and anyone, including his own people, when his personal survival or success required it. The Republic counterattack, when it came, was thorough. Jedi and Republic forces followed the retreating Sith into Sith space, pressing their advantage with the information Gav had provided. The lore describes the assault on the Sith Empire's core systems as devastating. Worlds that had been part of the Empire for thousands of years were invaded. The Sith military, which had committed its primary strength to the invasion fleet, could not mount an adequate defense. Korriban itself was not destroyed, but the symbolic heart of the Sith Empire was violated. Republic and Jedi forces reached the sacred world, and the lore suggests that this, more than any military defeat, was what broke the spirit of the Empire's defenders. Korriban being accessible to outsiders was not just a military setback, it was a desecration. Sado himself survived the war's conclusion. Defeated and betrayed by his own subordinates, he fled into the deep reaches of space with the few followers he had left, and eventually settled on Yavin 4. The lore records him spending his later years experimenting with Sith alchemy on the local Massassi species, enslaving them, using them in rituals, building temples that persist into the original trilogy era as the Rebel Alliance's base. The Massassi temples on Yavin 4, which Luke Skywalker would one day walk through, were built by the enslaved descendants of Sith warriors, shaped by a Dark Lord who had lost everything through his own overreach. Ludo Kresh, the isolationist who had argued against the war, tried to capitalize on Sado's defeat to claim the Dark Lord position. The lore records his attempt to rally the remains of the Empire against the Republic advance, but he died in the process, either in battle with Sado's remaining forces or in combat with the Republic, depending on which source you consult. His death ended the last credible internal challenge to the collapse of the First Sith Empire. The aftermath of the Great Hyperspace War was catastrophic for the Sith. The Empire's military was shattered, its core worlds were occupied or devastated. Its political leadership was dead, fled, or discredited. The Jedi and Republic forces, following up their military victory, did something that shaped the next several thousand years of galactic history. They attempted to eliminate the Sith as a presence in the galaxy. This is described in the lore as the Great Purge, and its effectiveness is presented as genuinely significant. Sith temples were destroyed. Sith artifacts were captured or sealed. Sith Lords who had survived the war were hunted down. The surviving Sith species were scattered. The knowledge that had been accumulated over thousands of years was disrupted, lost in many cases, preserved in a few cases through holocrons and hidden caches that would only become relevant centuries later. What the Republic could not do, and what the lore consistently returns to as the central lesson of this period, was ensure that the Sith were truly gone. The dark side does not simply disappear because its practitioners are killed. Korriban remained a nexus of dark side energy. The tombs of the ancient Sith Lords remained, and the spirits within them remained. The scattered survivors of the Empire scattered but did not die. Seeds were planted that would sprout again. The Great Hyperspace War also changed the Jedi Order in ways the lore treats as significant. The war had revealed vulnerabilities in Jedi knowledge, specifically how little they understood about Sith techniques, Sith philosophy, and the specific applications of dark side power that the Sith had developed over thousands of years. Some Jedi argued that this gap needed to be addressed by studying Sith knowledge more directly. Others argued this was dangerous and that the Order's strength came from its clear separation from the dark side. This debate would recur across the subsequent millennia. The Republic itself came out of the Great Hyperspace War changed. The knowledge that something like the Sith Empire existed, that the galaxy beyond the Republic's borders was not empty space, but potentially hostile territory, reshaped Republic policy in ways the lore describes as sometimes productive and sometimes paranoid. The Senate debates about border security, about preemptive military action, about what obligations the Republic had to populations in Sith-adjacent space, were not entirely unlike debates that real-world polities have had about security and expansion. The period immediately after the war is one in which the sources available within the Star Wars lore are sparse. The Empire had collapsed. The survivors had scattered. What was happening in the ruins of Sith civilization was not well documented from either a Republic or a surviving Sith perspective. What the lore suggests, pieced together from later sources, is that this was a period of genuine chaos for Sith culture, a time when the structures that had organized the Empire were gone, and what remained was fragmented, desperate, and struggling to survive. Some of the most interesting figures of this immediate post-war period are the Sith survivors who managed to avoid the Republic purge. They are described in the lore as resourceful, adaptive, and willing to do things that the more establishment Sith of the pre-war Empire would have found unthinkable. Hiding in plain sight, operating without the institutional support that the Empire had provided, staying alive in a galaxy actively trying to eliminate them, these survivors developed skills and orientations that would eventually contribute to the reformation of Sith power. The native Sith species in this period were left in a genuinely terrible position. Their civilization had been built on and around the Empire. With the Empire gone, they were a scattered remnant on worlds that had been devastated by war and then targeted by Republic purge operations. The lore tracks the decline of the Sith species numbers over the subsequent centuries as a combination of war casualties, purge killings, and the simple demographic reality of a small population with a damaged civilization. Korriban, abandoned but not destroyed, became a dead world in a very specific sense. The dark side energy remained, the tombs remained, the spirits within the tombs remained. But the living inhabitants were gone, fled, or killed, and the world settled into a kind of suspended animation, ancient and powerful and waiting. It would be rediscovered, again and again, by those who sensed what was there and came looking for it. The Great Hyperspace War's legacy is visible across all the subsequent eras of Sith history. The pattern it established, Sith power building in secret, making a bold move against the Republic, achieving initial success, and then being overwhelmed by the Republic's greater resources and the Jedi Order's defensive capabilities, would be repeated with variations in every subsequent major Sith Republic conflict. Each iteration of this cycle would teach surviving Sith something about what they needed to do differently, gradually refining their approach over thousands of years. Naga Sadow, dying on Yavin 4, left behind not just the Massassi temples, but a presence in the Force that the lore describes as persistent. His knowledge, his ambition, and something of his essence lingered in the dark side in a way that affected later Force users who came to that moon. The Massassi culture, shaped by his domination and transformed by his alchemy, persisted for thousands of years after him, a living artifact of the first Sith Empire's reach and its methods. The question that the lore seems to be asking through this entire arc is whether the Great Hyperspace War was inevitable. Could things have gone differently? If Ludo Kresh had won the succession struggle instead of Naga Sadow, would the Sith have remained in isolation long enough to build something more sustainable? If Sadow had been a better strategist and won the war outright, what would Sith rule over the Republic have looked like? The lore does not answer these questions, but it raises them, and they give the history a texture beyond simple good versus evil conflict. The first Sith Empire, from its founding in the aftermath of the Dark Jedi exile to its collapse after the Great Hyperspace War, lasted several thousand years. It built a genuine civilization, produced remarkable culture and philosophy alongside its violence and oppression, and demonstrated that the Sith were capable of constructing and maintaining a complex society rather than simply destroying existing ones. Its end was self-inflicted in a very real sense, brought about by a single Dark Lord's reckless ambition and poor strategic judgment. But it was also made possible by everything the Empire had built, all that military power, all that accumulated knowledge, turned toward a goal that was not quite achievable with the tools at hand. The Sith would return. They always return. But the form they took when they returned would be shaped by everything that happened during the Great Hyperspace War and its aftermath, by the lessons drawn from Sadow's failure, by the scars left by the Purge, and by the long, patient work of rebuilding that the scattered survivors would undertake in the shadows of a galaxy that thought it had finally solved its Sith problem. Chapter 4, The Long Dark, Sith Survival, Exar Kun, and the Brotherhood of Darkness, the period between the Great Hyperspace War and the next great crisis of Sith power spans roughly 4,000 years in the Star Wars timeline. And calling it a period of Sith dormancy would be a mistake. The Sith did not sleep during those millennia. They endured, adapted, reformed, collapsed, and reformed again, in a pattern that the lore suggests was not chaos, but something closer to evolution. Each cycle taught the survivors what did not work. Each collapse eliminated the approaches that were insufficient. What emerged from 4,000 years of this process was not the same Sith tradition that had built the First Empire, but something leaner, stranger, and in some ways more dangerous. In the centuries immediately after the Great Hyperspace War, the surviving Sith were genuinely fragmented. There was no empire, no Dark Lord, no institutional structure. What there were, scattered across the outer regions of the galaxy, were individual Sith survivors and small groups clinging to their knowledge and their tradition in whatever way they could. The lore suggests that many of these survivors deliberately disguised themselves, operating as ordinary citizens, as merchants, as wanderers, while maintaining their practices in secret. The rediscovery of Sith knowledge happened in multiple ways during this period. Some of it was preserved in holocrons hidden before the Purge, objects that their creators had anticipated might need to survive a period of suppression. Some of it was reconstructed from fragments, from temple carvings in remote locations that Republic purge teams had not found, from oral traditions maintained by populations that had been part of the Sith Empire's non-force sensitive majority. Some of it was simply reinvented, dark side practitioners discovering techniques independently that the first Sith Empire had developed thousands of years earlier. The Sith tradition of passing knowledge from master to apprentice proved more resilient than any institution. An academy could be destroyed, a temple could be burned. But if a master had trained even one apprentice before dying, and that apprentice survived, the chain continued. The lore presents this as one of the fundamental reasons the Sith could not be fully eliminated. The transmission mechanism for their tradition was too decentralized to completely destroy. Approximately 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the lore records the first significant Sith resurgence since the Great Hyperspace War. This resurgence was built around a man who had begun his life as a Jedi, Freedon Nad. His story is one of the most interesting templates in Sith history because it illustrates a path that would be travelled again and again. A Jedi who found the dark side not through corruption, but through something closer to genuine philosophical conversion. Who went looking for power the Jedi could not give him, found the ancient Sith tradition, and decided to walk that road fully. Nad studied under what remained of the Sith tradition, eventually reaching Yavin 4 and the presence of Naga Sado's spirit, and came away with enough Sith knowledge to establish himself as a genuine dark side practitioner. He conquered the world of Onderon, founded a dynasty, and established a Sith presence that persisted for centuries after his death, largely through the Force presence he deliberately left behind in his tomb. The Nadist tradition, the worship of Freedon Nad as a dark side figure, became a feature of Onderon's politics for generations. This is the pattern that recurs throughout the Middle Sith period. Individual figures of extraordinary ability, who establish localized Sith influence, who train successors and leave behind Force presences in their tombs, who die but whose influence continues to shape events long after their physical deaths. The lore treats this as characteristic of the dark side, which the sources suggest does not release its most powerful practitioners at death in the same way the light side does. The Sith of this period did not all know about each other. There was no coordinating structure, no communication network among dark side practitioners. What there was, according to the lore, was something more diffuse. A kind of dark side gravity, a tendency for the Force to pull those who used it in certain ways toward the knowledge and traditions of the Sith. Dark side practitioners who went looking for power found, eventually, that there was a tradition to find. Approximately 4,000 years before Yavin, the lore records one of the most dramatic Sith resurgences of the Middle Period, the career of Exar Kun. His story begins as a Jedi student, curious and ambitious, who became frustrated with the Jedi Order's restrictions on knowledge. He was specifically drawn to Sith lore, to the texts and artifacts that the Jedi had sealed away after the Great Hyperspace War. His teachers warned him. He did not listen. Kun's transformation from Jedi to Sith is described in the lore as partly chosen and partly coerced. He sought out Sith artifacts and Sith knowledge on his own initiative, and the dark side and the spirit of Freedon Nad, whose presence he encountered, essentially offered him a choice: accept the dark side fully or die. The lore is careful to note that Kun chose. He was not simply overwhelmed. He decided that the power available through the dark side was worth the cost. This distinction matters because it shapes how his subsequent career is understood. Kun established himself on Yavin 4, the moon that had been Naga Sado's final refuge, and used the Sith knowledge encoded in the temples there to take his mastery to a level that frightened even other dark side practitioners. He enslaved the Massassi, continuing a tradition that dated back to Sado himself, and used them for massive alchemical projects, the construction of new temples, the creation of Sith war beasts, experiments in dark side ritual. The scale of what Khun accomplished on Yavin 4 using enslaved labor is one of the grimmer elements of his story. What Khun was building toward was not a Sith Empire in the conventional sense, but something more personal, a power base from which he could pursue his specific agenda, which combined genuine philosophical commitment to the dark side with a more personal desire to prove that the Jedi Order had been wrong to restrict the knowledge he had pursued. His alliance with a Mandalorian named Ulic Cheldroma, who had fallen to the dark side through a different path, created a partnership that the lore presents as both genuinely formidable and ultimately self-defeating. The Great Sith War, which Khun's activities precipitated, was devastating for the Republic and the Jedi Order. Multiple Jedi fell to Khun's manipulation and influence. The Krath cult, which had emerged from Nad's tradition and become entangled with Khun's ambitions, contributed to the chaos. The war cost the Jedi enormous casualties, including some of the most powerful masters of the era. Khun's ability to reach into the Jedi Order and turn masters against each other was a technique that pointed towards something more sophisticated than simple battlefield conquest. Khun's fall was partly tactical and partly structural. When the Republic counterattack came, he was isolated on Yavin 4, his alliance with Cheldroma severed by the latter's capture, his Massassi workforce reduced by the demands of the war. The Jedi assault on Yavin 4 was overwhelming. Facing total defeat, Khun chose the option that the most powerful Sith tended to choose when physical survival was no longer possible. He bound his spirit to the temples of Yavin 4, sacrificing his body in a ritual that was supposed to allow him to wait out whatever came next. He waited 4,000 years. The lore records his spirit's attempt to corrupt Luke Skywalker's new Jedi Academy in the period after Return of the Jedi, a fascinating coda to an ancient story. The particular bitterness of Khun's long wait, trapped in the stones of temples he had built with enslaved hands, feeling the galaxy change and move without him, is something the lore does not dwell on much, but which, if you stop to consider it, is genuinely haunting. The pattern of the Middle Sith period continued after Khun, individual dark side figures rising, establishing themselves, being defeated, leaving behind legacies that shaped the next generation. The Jedi Order, for its part, began to develop better institutional responses to these recurring crises, though the lore also suggests that each Sith resurgence exposed new vulnerabilities in the Order's defences. The culmination of the Middle Period's Sith history came in what the lore calls the New Sith Wars, a prolonged period of conflict that the sources suggest lasted roughly 1,000 years and involved multiple waves of Sith Lords making coordinated and eventually nearly successful attempts to destroy the Republic and the Jedi Order. The specifics of this period are less well documented in the lore than either the first Sith Empire era or the subsequent Old Republic era, but the broad strokes are significant. The Brotherhood of Darkness, which is the last major organised Sith faction before Darth Bane's restructuring, represents a kind of endpoint for the old Sith tradition. The Brotherhood was, in some ways, an attempt to do what the first Sith Empire had done, organise large numbers of dark side practitioners into a coordinated military and political force capable of challenging the Republic directly. It had thousands of Sith members, organised into academies with ranking systems and command structures. The Brotherhood's fundamental weakness was structural, having thousands of Sith, all practicing a tradition that taught that strength was the only legitimate basis for authority, that competition was healthy, that the weak existed to be dominated by the strong, meant that the Brotherhood was constantly consuming its own energy in internal conflicts. The lore describes the Brotherhood's academies as places of extraordinary ambition and constant lethal competition, where students killed each other for rank and masters killed each other for position. Lord Khan, who led the Brotherhood, understood this problem but did not solve it. His solution was a doctrine he called the Rule of the Strong, an attempt to direct the competitive energies of Sith practitioners outward against the Republic rather than inward against each other. It worked, partially, long enough for the Brotherhood to threaten the Republic seriously. But it could not hold. The internal contradictions of trying to organize competitive individualists into a coherent army were too great. The Battle of Ruusan was the Brotherhood's final engagement. The lore records a series of battles on that world between Brotherhood Sith and a Jedi army of light led by Lord Hoth, a conflict that devastated both sides. The Brotherhood's endgame, when Khan realized they were losing, was the Thought Bomb, a weapon of mass destruction using the dark side of the Force, an explosion of concentrated dark side energy that killed every Force user in range, Sith and Jedi alike. Khan deployed it with his surviving followers, killing themselves along with their enemies. The Thought Bomb did not simply kill its victims. It trapped their Force essences in a kind of dark side prison, a sphere of pure dark side energy on the surface of Ruusan, where the spirits of the dead were held in perpetual agony. The lore describes this as one of the darkest acts in Sith history, and it is one of those details that makes the Sith history feel genuinely tragic as much as villainous. The last act of the Brotherhood of Darkness was to condemn its own members, the true believers who had fought and died for the Sith cause, to eternal imprisonment. Khan himself is presented in the lore as a complex figure. He was not a simple tyrant. He was a capable leader who understood, better than most Sith of his era, that the internal competition of the Sith tradition was a structural weakness that needed to be addressed. He just failed to address it effectively, and his failure cost both his own people and his enemies enormously. The final irony of his leadership is that the solution to the problem he identified would be developed not by him, but by the single survivor of Ruusan who had deliberately arranged for the Brotherhood's destruction. That survivor was Darth Bane. Chapter 5. Darth Bane, and the rule of two Darth Bane, is one of the most consequential figures in all of Star Wars lore, and not in the way that most people mean when they say someone is consequential. He did not conquer worlds. He did not lead great armies. He was not a battlefield genius or a charismatic ruler. What Darth Bane did was think, more clearly and more ruthlessly than any Sith in 1,000 years, about what was wrong with the Sith tradition and how to fix it. The solution he arrived at was so radical, so counterintuitive, and so effective that it defined the next 1,000 years of Sith history and shaped the events of the original Star Wars trilogy. Bane's origins were not exceptional. The lore describes him as born in poverty on a mining world, the son of a miner, growing up in circumstances that were genuinely brutal. What he had was anger and Force sensitivity, both of which he had in abundance. His early life was defined by his relationship with his father, whom the lore describes as abusive and contemptible, and by the discovery that the feelings he had been suppressing and trying to manage were actually the fuel for something real, something powerful. He found his way to the Brotherhood of Darkness and their academy system. The lore describes him as an exceptional student, not because he was more naturally gifted than his peers, but because he was more serious, more committed, and more willing to accept painful truths about himself and about the Sith tradition he was learning. He excelled at the Brotherhood's academies in ways that drew attention, rose through their ranks, and began to develop doubts about the organization's fundamental approach. His doubts crystallized around a specific intellectual problem. The Sith philosophy, as the Brotherhood taught it, held that competition and conflict between Sith were healthy, that they produced strength. But when Bane looked at the Brotherhood's history and at the history of the Sith tradition more broadly, he saw a different pattern. The Sith had been defeated repeatedly by the Jedi and the Republic. The explanations given were always about the specifics of each defeat, the wrong strategy, the wrong moment, bad luck. Bane thought these explanations were wrong. He thought the Sith kept losing because of something structural, something built into the way the Sith organized themselves. His reading of the ancient Sith texts, specifically the works of Darth Revan, whom we will discuss in context shortly, brought him to an insight that the lore presents as Bane's central contribution to Sith history. Large numbers of Sith, each pursuing their own power and competing with each other, did not produce collective strength. They produced collective weakness, because the energy that should have been directed outward was always being consumed internally. The Brotherhood of Darkness was not a more powerful version of the Sith tradition. It was a more elaborate version of the same mistake. The solution Bane arrived at was the rule of two. There shall be only two. A master and an apprentice, one to embody the power, one to crave it. This doctrine, which Bane implemented by engineering the Brotherhood's destruction at Ruusan, sounds simple but contains a complex logic. By limiting the Sith to two at any time, you eliminate internal competition. All the energy goes into one master-apprentice relationship. The master teaches everything they know. The apprentice eventually kills the master and takes an apprentice of their own. Each generation is stronger than the last because the apprentice, in order to kill the master, has to surpass the master. Bane's manipulation of the Brotherhood's final battle is one of the more chilling episodes in Sith lore. He did not fight for the Brotherhood. He positioned himself to survive Ruusan, subtly influenced Lord Khan toward the suicidal thought bomb strategy, and walked away from the battle that killed every other Sith on both sides. He was not grieving for his fallen comrades. He had arranged for them to fall. The old Sith, with all their numbers and their academies and their competing lords, were dead, and what remained was Bane, alone, ready to begin again. His choice of apprentice is fascinating in the context of everything that came before. He chose a girl named Zana, the niece of a soldier who had fought on the Jedi side at Ruusan, a child with immense potential whom he took from her family and shaped into the first bearer of the new Sith tradition. The lore's account of Bane and Zana's relationship as master and apprentice points towards something important. The rule of two was not just a strategic doctrine, but a pedagogical philosophy, a completely different way of thinking about how Sith knowledge and power should be transmitted. Under the rule of two, the master does not merely teach techniques. The master teaches everything: philosophy, strategy, history, political understanding, personal psychology. The apprentice is not a student in any conventional sense, but a specific project, the next version of the Sith, shaped deliberately and completely. Bane understood that each generation needed to exceed the last, which meant the master had to teach the apprentice not just what the master knew, but how to think beyond it. Bane himself was not static after establishing the rule of two. He continued his own development, and the lore records one of his most disturbing decisions: his attempt to obtain a different kind of Sith power through the Obelisk parasites. The Obelisks were ancient creatures that attached to Force users and fed on dark side energy, providing extraordinary physical protection and Force enhancement in exchange for constant physical agony and progressive corruption. Bane deliberately allowed them to cover much of his body, trading comfort and eventual sanity for power. This decision illustrates something important about Bane, that the lore emphasizes: his relationship with suffering was not incidental, but philosophical. Bane believed that the Sith grew through adversity, that comfort was weakness, that every cost paid in pain was an investment in power. The Obelisks were an extreme expression of this belief, a chosen torture that he accepted because the benefits were real. He wore them until a confrontation required their removal, and the process of removing them nearly killed him. Darth Zana, as Bane's apprentice grew, developed her own approach to the Sith tradition that was different from her master's in significant ways. Where Bane was direct, aggressive, physically dominant, Zana was subtle, patient, and oriented toward manipulation. The lore describes her as developing Sith sorcery, specifically the ability to create dark side illusions that could break a person's mind, rather than the more combative Force techniques Bane favoured. This difference in approach was not a failing of her training, but a fulfillment of the rule of two's logic. The apprentice was developing capabilities the master lacked. The question of when Zana would challenge Bane is one of the law's more interesting tensions. The rule of two required that the apprentice kill the master when ready, but Bane also understood that premature challenges were fatal for the tradition, because if the apprentice challenged before being genuinely superior, the lineage ended. Bane himself was watching Zana for signs of readiness, and the law suggests that he found the waiting genuinely difficult. Not because he feared death, but because he could not always tell whether her patience was wisdom or weakness. Their final confrontation came when Zana judged herself ready. The details of the duel in the law are interesting, because they reveal something about what mastery in the rule of two tradition actually looked like. Bane was still physically formidable. He was still extraordinarily powerful in the Force. Zana defeated him not by overpowering him, but by using techniques he had not anticipated, by being different from him in ways that made her effective against him specifically. The rule of two had worked exactly as intended. What Bane left behind was more than a successor. He left a complete restructuring of what the Sith were. No more empires, no more armies, no more academies full of competing students. Just two, working in the shadows, building towards something they might not live to see. The law describes this as the defining feature of the post-Bane Sith. They became patient in a way that the old Sith had never been, because they had to be. Two people cannot conquer the galaxy in a lifetime. What they can do is start a process that will take 1,000 years. The secrecy Bane imposed on the new Sith tradition was total. The Jedi believed, after Ruusan, that the Sith were extinct. The Galactic Senate declared the Sith Wars over and the Sith defeated. The Republic entered a period of relative peace and prosperity, and the Jedi Order, no longer fighting active Sith wars, turned its attention to other matters. The Sith, meanwhile, were right there in the shadows, two of them, watching and planning and teaching. Each generation of the post-Bane Sith line faced specific challenges. The requirement to operate in complete secrecy, while also gaining the skills and knowledge needed to eventually challenge the Republic and the Jedi Order, created constant tension. How do you train a warrior in secret? How do you accumulate political influence without revealing yourself? How do you maintain the emotional intensity that the dark side requires, the anger and ambition that fuel Sith power, while also exercising the patience that secrecy demands? The law does not fully document every master-apprentice pair in the millennium between Bane and Palpatine. Some names are known. Darth Cognus, Zana's apprentice. Darth Millennial, who broke from the tradition briefly and started his own cult before being defeated. Others whose names are fragments or simply unknown. What the law suggests is that the 1,000-year lineage had its crises, moments where the succession nearly broke, where the Sith faced extinction again, where a master died before fully training an apprentice, requiring extraordinary improvisation. Bane's legacy is also visible in the way the Sith who came after him thought about time. Pre-Bane Sith thought in terms of their own lifetimes, their own power, what they could accomplish before they died. Post-Bane Sith thought across generations, understanding themselves as part of a project larger than any individual. This shift in temporal perspective is one of the most significant changes Bane made to the Sith tradition, and it is what made the eventual success of Darth Sidious possible. The rule of two also changed what Sith knowledge was and how it was transmitted. Without academies, without libraries, without the institutional preservation mechanisms of the old empire, knowledge had to be embodied. What the master knew, the master had to teach. What the apprentice learned, the apprentice had to internalize. The holocrons existed, and the post-Bane Sith maintained them, but the primary transmission mechanism was direct from master to apprentice, a more personal and more complete form of knowledge transfer than any academy could provide. Darth Bane also left behind, in the lore, a ghost. His spirit was not a gentle one. The lore hints at attempts to persist after death in the Sith tradition, and Bane is one of the figures connected to this. Whether his spirit truly persisted, or whether what seemed to be his spirit was something else entirely, is left deliberately ambiguous in the sources. This ambiguity is characteristic of the way the lore treats the most powerful Sith, always leaving open the question of whether their influence truly ended with their physical deaths. The philosophical contribution of Bane cannot be separated from the strategic one. He did not just restructure the Sith organisationally, he reformulated what the Sith were for. The old Sith had been oriented toward empire, toward the creation and maintenance of a civilization that expressed Sith values. Bane's Sith were oriented toward a single goal, the destruction of the Jedi Order and the domination of the galaxy. Everything else was subordinate to that. It is a colder, more focused, more purely destructive vision than the civilization building of the first Sith Empire, and in some ways, a more dangerous one. What Bane created, ultimately, was a weapon. Two people, in each generation, sharpening themselves against each other and against the world, building toward a strike that their successors would deliver. The weapon took 1,000 years to fully prepare. When it was ready, it was wielded by Darth Sidious, who came closer to total success than any Sith since the First Empire. And even his success was not quite what Bane had intended, though that is a story for a later chapter. Bane himself died knowing he had built something, but not knowing what it would produce. He had laid the foundation and the rules. The edifice that rose from that foundation was not his to see. In this sense, he is one of the most paradoxically selfless figures in Sith history, a man who dedicated his entire life to building something he would never benefit from, whose entire project was oriented toward successors he would never know. The Sith Code says, peace is a lie. Bane seems to have found something close to satisfaction, not in peace, but in the knowledge that he had changed the rules of the game. Whether the game was worth playing at all is a different question. Chapter 6. The True Sith Empire, Return from the Unknown Regions here, is something the Jedi Order and the Galactic Republic did not know for 3 centuries. The Sith Empire had not collapsed at the end of the Great Hyperspace War. Not entirely. While the Republic's forces had shattered the Empire's military and driven its leadership into exile or death, a significant remnant had escaped into the unknown regions, beyond the maps the Republic possessed, beyond any hyperspace lanes the Jedi could follow. They had gone somewhere the Republic could not reach, and they had spent those 3 centuries doing what the Sith had always done when cornered, rebuilding. This is the Sith Empire as depicted in the Old Republic, the MO that has produced more Sith lore per square inch than almost any other source in the Star Wars canon and extended universe. The Empire that emerges from the unknown regions roughly 300 years after the Great Hyperspace War is not the same empire that went into them. It has been transformed by its isolation, by its defeat, by the specific figures who guided it during the long retreat, and by something that 3 centuries of uninterrupted Sith culture, without the moderating influence of contact with outside civilizations, had done to its values and its political structures. The figure most responsible for the Empire's survival and reconstitution was the Emperor, a Sith Lord whose identity and nature became one of the most elaborate mysteries in Old Republic lore. He is called Vitiate in some sources, Tenebrae in others, and both names point toward an origin story that is genuinely disturbing. Born on a provincial Sith world to a family of minor Sith Lords, he demonstrated Force ability that was categorically different from anything anyone around him had encountered. His father, recognizing what his son was, reportedly feared him. What the young Tenebrae did with his power, before he was even of adult age in any conventional sense, was experiment on the people around him. He did not just learn the Sith tradition, he tested its applications. The lore describes his early career as a series of increasingly large-scale exercises in domination and dark side power, culminating in an event on his homeworld that effectively established what he was capable of. Through a ritual of immense scale, he drained the life force of the entire population of his planet, killing every living thing and consuming their life essence to transform himself into something the law struggles to categorize. He emerged from this ritual as effectively immortal, bound to life through the Force in a way that normal death could not break. He was also more powerful than any Sith in recent memory, having consumed the Force connections of an entire world's population. What he had done was monstrous by any standard, and the law does not try to contextualize it as anything other than that. But it was also, from a purely strategic perspective, enormously effective. He would not age. He would not die in the normal way. He was now a long game player, in a very specific sense. The surviving Sith Lords of the post-Great Hyperspace War period recognized this figure's power and largely submitted to it. He took the title of Emperor and organized the retreating Sith into a functional polity during the long journey into the unknown regions. The lore describes this period as extraordinarily difficult, the Sith retreating while pursued, managing logistics while under constant pressure, maintaining internal cohesion in a culture that was built on competition when competition was the one thing they could not afford. That they managed it at all is a testament to how thoroughly the Emperor dominated the figures around him. In the unknown regions, the Empire found a new homeworld. Dromund Kaas. The lore describes it as a world permanently shrouded in storms, dark side energy so concentrated that the sky itself was charged with it. It was, in many ways, a perfect Sith world, hostile, powerful, and completely isolated from the Republic. The Empire spent 3 centuries rebuilding on and around Dromund Kaas, constructing a capital city and eventually an entire civilization that in some ways exceeded the original Empire in its sophistication. The capital city of Kaas City became one of the most elaborately described Sith cities in all the lore. The architecture was Sith in its orientation toward power and scale. Enormous temples and government buildings, dark materials, lightning-lit skies. But it was also a functioning city, with infrastructure, with an economy, with social structures that accommodated the millions of ordinary citizens who lived and worked within the Empire's borders. The lore takes care to present the Empire as a real society, not just a military force wearing a civilization's costume. The Emperor's citadel, his seat of power in Kaas City, is described in the lore as a building designed to communicate a specific message, that the Emperor's power was absolute, permanent, and connected to something larger than politics. It was not just impressive, it was meant to be overwhelming, to make anyone who entered it feel small and contingent in comparison. This was deliberate. The Emperor understood the psychology of power and used architecture the way his predecessors had used the ancient Korriban temples. The imperial political structure that developed during the Unknown Regions period was more formalized than the old empires had been. The Emperor sat at the top, absolute in theory, if not always in practice. Below him was the Dark Council, a body of 12 Sith Lords, each commanding a sphere of influence, military, civilian, scientific, philosophical, and so on. The Dark Council's function was ostensibly to advise the Emperor and coordinate the Empire's various functions, but in practice, it was also a managed competition, a controlled arena in which the most powerful Sith Lords competed for position and resources without ever threatening the Emperor directly. The Sith Academy on Korriban, which was re-established after the Empire's return, is one of the most detailed institutions in Old Republic lore. The Academy was where young Force sensitives were trained in the Sith tradition, where the Empire's next generation of warriors, lords, and scholars was produced. The lore describes it as a place of extraordinary brutality, where students competed against each other with sometimes lethal results, where the weak were genuinely eliminated, and where the standards were set by the most powerful Sith instructors in the Empire. What distinguishes the Old Republic-era Sith Academy from, say, a Jedi temple is not just the philosophy, but the methods. The Academy actively encouraged students to undermine, betray, and sometimes kill each other. This was not a bug in the system, but a feature. The logic, consistent with Sith philosophy throughout the tradition, was that if you could not survive the competition of the Academy, you were not strong enough to be a Sith warrior. The Academy's casualty rate was significant. The Empire's military was rebuilt over 3 centuries into something that could genuinely challenge the Republic. The lore describes a military organized around Sith commanders, with conventional soldiers, officers, and equipment forming the bulk of the force, while Sith Lords directed them. The Sith military had a doctrine that emphasized aggressive action, concentration of force, and the use of the dark side as both a practical and a psychological weapon. The terror that Sith warriors inspired in their opponents was not incidental, but cultivated. The Empire also developed an intelligence apparatus, the Imperial Intelligence Service, that the lore presents as one of the most sophisticated in the galaxy. Intelligence services require patience, subtlety, and the ability to operate without the protection of overt military force, all of which might seem counter-Sith. But the Empire understood that pure military power was not sufficient for galactic dominance. Information was also power, and the cipher agents who served Imperial intelligence were, in their own way, as formidable as any Sith Lord. The relationship between the Sith ruling class and the non-Sith population of the Empire is one of the more nuanced elements of the Old Republic lore. The Empire was not simply a pyramid of Sith oppressing everyone below them. It was a more complex social structure in which non-Sith could and did rise to positions of genuine authority, particularly in the military and the bureaucracy. Some of the most capable Imperial commanders in the lore were non-Force sensitive officers who had earned their positions through ability. The Sith valued strength and competence, and they were pragmatic enough to recognize these qualities in non-Force users. That said, the lore is also clear that the fundamental orientation of the Empire was towards Sith supremacy. Non-Force users, however capable, were always ultimately subject to Sith authority. The lore within the Empire was not blind to power differentials. A Sith Lord had privileges that no ordinary citizen possessed. The Empire was a meritocracy within its own terms, but those terms were defined by the Sith ruling class and built around Sith values. The treatment of alien species within the Empire is another significant element. The original Sith species had been largely absorbed and transformed by centuries of interbreeding with human refugees, and pure Sith species individuals were now rare even within the Empire. But the Empire had complex and often fraught relationships with other alien species within its borders. Some alien species were valued allies or subjects, others were enslaved. The specifics depended on the species, on their perceived utility, and on the political calculations of the Sith Lords who governed the regions they inhabited. The Empire's return to the known galaxy was not an immediate declaration of war. For a period, the Empire operated through agents, through proxies, through careful intelligence gathering, assessing the Republic's current strength and identifying vulnerabilities. The lore describes this as a period of deliberate preparation, shaped by the memory of the Great Hyperspace War and the determination not to repeat Naga Sado's mistake of attacking before the moment was right. The War of the Sith Emperor's Return, which began roughly a century before the events of the Old Republic game, was not triggered by Imperial readiness in any simple sense. It was triggered by a combination of Imperial judgment that the time had come and Republic complacency that had allowed vulnerabilities to develop. The initial Sith assault was devastating, repeating some of the patterns of the Great Hyperspace War, but with a discipline and sophistication that the old Empire's invasion had lacked. The sack of Coruscant, which ended the Great Galactic War and produced the Treaty of Coruscant, is one of the most dramatic events in Old Republic lore. Imperial forces breached the defences of the Republic's capital world, the seat of the Senate, and held it hostage while peace negotiations concluded. The treaty that resulted was deeply favourable to the Sith Empire, ceding significant territory and establishing a Cold War status quo that recognised Sith imperial authority over a substantial portion of the galaxy. The Empire got what it wanted from the Treaty of Coruscant, but the lore suggests that the Emperor's actual goal was never territorial sovereignty. His long game was something else entirely, something so extreme that even his own Dark Council would have been horrified if they had understood it fully. The Emperor's true objective was not the conquest of the galaxy, but its annihilation, or more precisely its consumption, the extension of what he had done to his home world to the entire galaxy, consuming all life to become something beyond a Sith Lord or even a human. This revelation, which emerges in pieces across the Old Republic lore, recontextualizes the entire Sith Empire of this era. The Empire was, in some readings, not a genuine civilization-building project, but a tool the Emperor was using for his own purposes. A structure he maintained because it was useful for his personal agenda, not because he cared about Sith supremacy or imperial expansion as goals in themselves. The Dark Council, the military, the academy system, all of it served the Emperor's purposes up to a point. Beyond that point, none of it mattered to him. The Emperor's relationship with the Force was different from any other Sith in the lore. Where most dark side practitioners drew on the Force and were shaped by it, where the Force influenced them as they used it, the Emperor had consumed Force connections, had made himself a kind of dark side void that absorbed rather than channeled. Some lore suggests he was so powerful that he could possess other bodies, maintain multiple instances of himself simultaneously, project his will across interstellar distances. Whether these things are presented as literal fact or as the terrified perceptions of those who encountered him is deliberately ambiguous. The Dark Council, operating without full knowledge of the Emperor's true intentions, spent the Cold War period managing the Empire's more ordinary political affairs. The 12 members competed with each other, formed alliances, conducted purges, and generally occupied themselves with the internal politics that the Sith tradition made inevitable. The lore presents individual Dark Council members as complex figures, some genuinely ideologically committed to the Sith tradition, some purely pragmatic power seekers, some who harboured doubts about the direction the Empire was taking. The Empire also had its military heroes, figures whose careers are documented in the lore with the same kind of detail that historical epics devote to their most compelling characters. Grand Moff types, admirals, generals, figures who were defined by their loyalty to the Empire rather than any specific ideological commitment to Sith philosophy. These characters give the Empire texture, showing that it was not just a hierarchy of Force users, but a civilization with a full range of human and Grenupan experience. The Cold War period also produced some of the most interesting dynamics in Sith Empire lore. The interactions between Imperial Sith and Republic Jedi, when both sides were nominally at peace, but neither truly trusted the peace to hold. Individual interactions between characters from both sides during this period show the complexity that the lore is capable of when it is at its best. Neither the Empire nor the Republic is simply good or evil. Both have their committed ideologues and their pragmatists, their true believers and their cynics. The eventual breakdown of the Treaty of Coruscant and the resumption of open warfare is, in retrospect, unsurprising, a peace founded on mutual fear, and neither side's genuine acceptance of the other's legitimacy was always going to be temporary. The Second War between the Empire and the Republic brought new catastrophes and new opportunities for both sides, continuing the cycle that had defined relations between Sith and Republic for thousands of years. What this era of Sith Empire history shows, more than anything else, is that the Sith were capable of genuine civilization when they were not actively undermining it through their own internal contradictions. The Old Republic-era empire was complex, sophisticated, and in some ways admirable in its discipline and organization. That it was oriented toward domination and built on suffering does not make it less real as a civilization. It makes it, if anything, more interesting as a subject for analysis, because it demonstrates that the darkness in Sith culture was not incompatible with competence, but was woven through the competence itself. Chapter 7. Revan, Malak, and the war within the war. If there is one figure in Sith history whose story defies simple categorization more than any other, it is Darth Revan. The lore around Revan is fragmentary, sometimes inconsistent across different sources, and deliberately mysterious in ways that go beyond simple gaps in the historical record. Revan is a figure who was a Jedi, became a Sith Lord, was captured and reconverted to the light side, fought for the Republic he had once sought to destroy, and then, according to the old Republic lore, turned again towards something that was neither quite Jedi nor quite Sith. The layers of his story are genuinely difficult to fully untangle, and the lore seems to suggest that this difficulty is intentional, that Revan was a figure who resisted reduction to any simple narrative. His origins are obscure. The lore presents Revan as having been a Jedi Knight of considerable ability and charisma, one of the prominent younger members of the Order in the period preceding the Mandalorian Wars. When the Mandalorian clans launched their devastating campaign against Republic worlds, the Jedi Council declined to involve the Order directly, arguing that the Force had a plan that required patience. Revan disagreed. He took a group of Jedi who agreed with him, joined the Republic military, and led the counterattack against the Mandalorians. The Mandalorian Wars are significant context for Revan's story, because they represent a genuine philosophical disagreement rather than a simple fall to temptation. Revan's argument for intervention was not obviously wrong. The Mandalorians were devastating Republic worlds. The Jedi's non-intervention was costing civilian lives. The decision to act can be defended on the merits, and the lore acknowledges this even while tracing the costs that followed from it. The seeds of Revan's turn to the dark side were not planted in cruelty or selfishness, but in urgency and confidence, the certainty that he knew better than those who counselled patience. During the war against the Mandalorians, Revan began to change. The experience of total war, of commanding armies, of making decisions that traded lives for objectives, of using force techniques that the Jedi Order would have forbidden in the pursuit of victory, shaped him. The lore suggests he also encountered, during the campaign, evidence of something beyond the Mandalorian threat, hints of a larger danger in the unknown regions that the Mandalorian leadership had been in contact with. This discovery, which the sources identify as his first encounter with information about the Sith Empire hiding there, became one of the driving forces in his subsequent choices. After defeating the Mandalorians, Revan and his closest ally Malak disappeared into the unknown regions with a fleet. What they found there, and what was done to them, is one of the lore's deepest mysteries. The Old Republic sources suggest that the Emperor of the true Sith Empire encountered Revan in this period and attempted to bind him, to use his exceptional force ability as a tool for imperial purposes. The outcome of this encounter, according to different sources, was either that the Emperor succeeded in corrupting Revan, or that Revan partially resisted, absorbing some Sith knowledge while retaining enough of himself to maintain an agenda the Emperor did not control. What came back from the unknown regions was Darth Revan, Dark Lord of the Sith, accompanied by Darth Malak, and in command of a significant fleet that had been assembled from sources the Republic could not immediately identify. They attacked the Republic, and the initial campaign was stunningly effective. Revan was not just a force user, he was a strategic genius who had spent years commanding real armies against skilled opponents. His understanding of Republic military doctrine was intimate. He knew exactly where the weaknesses were. But the approach Revan took as Sith Conqueror was different from what earlier Sith Lords had done. Rather than trying to destroy the Republic's infrastructure, he seemed to be preserving it, taking control without obliteration, administering conquered territory rather than simply devastating it. The lore suggests this was strategic rather than merciful. Revan wanted a functioning republic under Sith control, not ruins, because he saw the threat from the true Sith Empire and understood that he would need those resources. The Jedi Council's response to Revan's conquest included a desperate gambit, ambushing Revan's flagship and capturing him. The confrontation went wrong, and what happened next is one of the lore's most celebrated twists, though we should note it is presented as historical rather than narrative. Malak, seeing an opportunity, turned on his master, ordering the fleet to fire on his own ship, killing or incapacitating Revan rather than allowing his capture to become a problem. The Jedi managed to bring Revan aboard, barely alive, and brought him to the Council. The decision the Council made with Revan in their custody is presented in the lore as deeply controversial and morally complex. They did not imprison him. They did not kill him. They used the Force to essentially overwrite his mind, suppressing his memories of his life as Darth Revan, and implanting a new identity, a Republic soldier whose loyalty to the Republic seemed genuine, because, in the new identity, it was genuine. The new Revan had no access to his former knowledge or his former self. He was, in a very real sense, a different person. This decision raises questions that the lore deliberately leaves unresolved. Was what the Council did ethical? They destroyed a person, at least the person Revan had been, without his consent, and replaced him with someone else. The lore presents arguments on both sides, that the new Revan was genuinely a new person and deserving of respect, that the old Revan's memories and choices had ceased to be the operating self. The fact that the new Revan, when he eventually recovered partial memories of his past, did not feel that he had been wronged by the Council, suggests one reading. The fact that the Council made this decision unilaterally suggests another. Malak, having effectively become Dark Lord of the Sith through his betrayal of Revan, was a different kind of Sith Lord than his predecessor. Where Revan had been strategic, preservation-minded, oriented toward a long game, Malak was cruder, more destructive, more straightforwardly interested in conquest for its own sake. His decision to use the Starforge, an ancient manufacturing station of Rakatan origin discovered during the Unknown Regions campaign, to produce fleets and armies without limit, was militarily powerful but strategically limited. He was building more weapons to do more of the same, rather than thinking about what came after victory. The conflict between Malak's Sith and the Republic, with the new Revan gradually recovering pieces of his identity and eventually having to confront what he had been, produced the story that the Knights of the Old Republic game tells. The resolution of that story, in which Revan defeats Malak and chooses the light side, is known broadly even by those who have not played the game. What is less broadly known is what happens after, in the Old Republic lore. The Revan of the post-Kota period is one of the most compelling figures in the extended Sith lore precisely because he does not fit the available categories. He is not a Jedi in the Order's conventional sense. He is not a Sith. He is someone who has walked both paths and come out the other side with a synthesis that is not quite either. The lore describes him going back into the unknown regions, trying to deal with the true Sith Empire threat he had discovered before his fall, and what happens to him there is a long and complicated story that Old Republic lore explores in its later content. What Revan's story contributes to the broader Sith narrative is significant. It demonstrates that the line between Jedi and Sith is less absolute than either tradition claims, that the dark side can be walked and survived, that a figure can choose the dark and choose again, and that the choices made in the name of the greater good can lead to the darkest places. Revan's fall was not simple corruption. It was the product of genuine moral reasoning applied without sufficient wisdom. This makes him one of the most instructive figures in the entire Sith history. Malak, for his part, is often treated as a secondary character in Revan's story, which is partly accurate and partly unfair. Malak chose the dark side, not through sophisticated philosophical reasoning, but through much simpler motives: ambition, resentment, and the influence of dark side corruption. He wanted power, he saw an opportunity, and he took it. His defeat at the hands of the restored Revan was not surprising. What is more interesting about Malak is his moment at the end, captured in the game's narrative, when he acknowledges that he could have been different and seems to genuinely wonder what would have happened if he had made other choices. That moment of reflection, coming from a mass murderer whose fleet had devastated worlds and killed millions, is one of the things that makes Sith lore genuinely compelling when it is at its best. The Sith are not always presented as simply evil. They are presented as people who made choices, often for reasons that had some internal logic, and who became through those choices something genuinely terrible. The tragedy is real, not just rhetorical. The period following Revan and Malak's war saw the emergence of another Sith faction that the lore calls the Sith Triumvirate, 3 dark side practitioners who had been lieutenants in Malak's forces and who survived his defeat to establish their own power base. The most significant of these was Darth Trier, known also as Kreia, whose philosophy was not conventional Sith, and not quite anything else either. She believed that the Force itself was the problem, that its dominance over events was a form of tyranny that needed to be ended. Her campaign against both Jedi and Sith was motivated not by a desire for power, but by something more disturbing, a genuine philosophical conviction that the galaxy would be better without the Force as an organizing principle. Trier's story, told in Knights of the Old Republic 2, is one of the deepest dives into Force philosophy in all of Star Wars. Her arguments, made in dialogue throughout the game, are not easily refuted. They engage seriously with the questions of free will, the nature of the Force, and the ethics of a universe organized around the will of an entity that nobody chose to obey. Whether she was right or wrong is left genuinely open by the game, and this ambiguity is part of what makes her such a compelling Sith-adjacent figure. The Exile, the player character of Kota 2, is another example of the lore presenting someone who walks between traditions without belonging fully to either. A Jedi who cut herself off from the Force to survive a battle that should have killed her. She represents a different kind of Force sensitivity than anything the Order recognized. Her relationship with Trier, her time as Trier's student, and her eventual confrontation with Trier produce some of the most philosophically rich content in all the Sith-related lore. The Sith Triumvirate as a whole points towards something important about the post-Revan period. The Sith tradition, even in its reduced and fragmented form, could produce extraordinarily powerful and philosophically sophisticated practitioners who pose genuine existential threats without the backing of an empire. Individual Sith, or small groups of them, could be as dangerous as large organizations under the right circumstances. This is the lesson that the Old Republic era teaches most consistently. Chapter 8. Darth Sidious, and the final Grand Plan. Darth Sidious, born Sheev Palpatine on Naboo, is the figure who actually completed what Darth Bane had started. He is the Sith Lord who, after 1,000 years of patient preparation across generations of masters and apprentices, successfully destroyed the Jedi Order, eliminated the Republic, and established Sith dominance over the galaxy. He accomplished what no Sith since the First Empire had managed, and he did it through a method that the old Empire could never have conceived. He became the Republic, while destroying it. His origins on Naboo are described in the lore as deceptively ordinary. A senator's son from a wealthy world associated with culture and refinement, Naboo being famous for its elegant cities and its artistic tradition. Nobody looking at young Palpatine would have seen the future emperor. The Sith tradition, under the rule of 2, required this invisibility. A Sith who was identifiable as a dark side practitioner would be hunted by the Jedi. Palpatine's entire career was built on the mastery of concealment. His master was Darth Plagueis, a moon who pursued the same obsession that the Sith Emperor of the Old Republic era had in a different form, cheating death. Plagueis was a scholar as much as a warrior, a Sith Lord who spent more time in laboratories than on battlefields, researching the connection between the Force and midi-chlorians, trying to understand whether the biological mechanisms of Force sensitivity could be manipulated to prevent death or even create life. The lore suggests he achieved some form of success in this research, though the nature and extent of that success is deliberately left unclear. Palpatine's relationship with Plagueis was the central feature of his formative years as a Sith. The lore presents Plagueis as a capable teacher and a genuinely brilliant mind, someone who saw in Palpatine the raw material for an exceptional Sith and invested accordingly. What Plagueis apparently did not adequately account for was the possibility that his investment would produce an apprentice capable of killing him before the time was right. Palpatine killed Plagueis while the latter slept, poisoned by wine, which is either a triumph of the Rule of Two's logic or a violation of it, depending on how you read the lore. After taking the title of Darth Sidious, Palpatine began his public career as a politician, a path that had no precedent in Sith history. Previous Sith Lords had manipulated politicians, had used proxies in political structures, had conducted intelligence operations within Republic systems. But a Sith Lord serving openly as a senator, gradually rising through legitimate democratic processes while pursuing a Sith agenda in parallel, was genuinely new. It required a level of patience and performance that the Sith tradition had not previously demanded. Darth Maul, Palpatine's first known apprentice, was the opposite of subtle. The lore describes Maul as having been taken from his Night Sister homeworld as an infant and shaped into a pure weapon, someone without political ambitions or philosophical complexity, defined entirely by his loyalty to Palpatine and his ferocity as a combatant. Maul's training was comprehensive and brutal, designed to produce a Sith who could fight, track, and kill with extraordinary effectiveness. He was not intended to be a thinker or a planner. He was the sword Palpatine would use when the time came. The particular tragedy of Maul's story, which the lore explores extensively in Clone Wars and other materials, is that he was betrayed by the plan he had devoted his life to serving. When he appeared in The Phantom Menace, cut in half by Obi-Wan Kenobi and left to die on Naboo, Palpatine did not grieve for him and did not attempt to recover him. Palpatine's calculation was that a damaged Maul was not useful, and that Count Dooku was a more valuable asset for the next phase of the plan. Maul's survival, his reconstruction through sheer will and dark side power, and his eventual discovery by his brother Savage Opress was entirely outside Palpatine's script. Count Dooku, Darth Tyrannus, was a different kind of Sith apprentice. Where Maul was a weapon, Dooku was an instrument of politics and persuasion. A former Jedi Master, a member of the Order's most senior tier, Dooku had left the Order before becoming Palpatine's apprentice, motivated by genuine disillusionment with the Republic's corruption. His turn to the Sith was partly philosophical and partly pragmatic, and the lore suggests he believed sincerely in some aspects of what he was doing, while being deceived about others. Dooku's role in the Grand Plan was to create and lead the Confederacy of Independent Systems, the separatist movement that would become the enemy side in the Clone Wars. He was, in other words, knowingly building the other side of a conflict that Palpatine was managing from both ends simultaneously. The Clone Wars were not a real war in the sense of representing genuine competing interests, though many of the people fighting in them had real interests. At the highest level, they were a manufactured crisis designed to give Palpatine the emergency powers he needed. The creation of the clone army itself is one of the more elaborate deceptions in Palpatine's plan. The army had been commissioned in secret by a Jedi Master who had been Sith-controlled and then killed to prevent that connection from being discovered, and was sitting ready to be deployed at the precise moment when the Senate would need a military force and no alternatives were available. The order had been placed 10 years before it was needed. The planning required for this is staggering even within the fictional context. Darth Vader, the figure that Anakin Skywalker would become, was Palpatine's masterpiece in terms of converting existing resources rather than creating from scratch. Anakin Skywalker was not a person Palpatine manufactured. He was a person Palpatine identified, cultivated, exploited, and finally corrupted. The grooming of Anakin from the moment of his discovery as a child, through the Jedi's training of him, through the Clone Wars, and finally to his fall, represents Palpatine's most sophisticated long-term project. The lore surrounding Anakin's fall has been extensively analysed, and the details are well known. What is worth noting in the context of Sith history is that Palpatine's approach to corrupting Anakin was completely different from anything in the prior Sith tradition. He did not appeal to ambition in the first instance, or to power hunger, or to resentment. He appealed to love, specifically to Anakin's terror of losing Padme, and he positioned himself as the only one who could teach Anakin the power to prevent death. He used Anakin's greatest strength, his capacity for love, as the lever to pry him loose from everything else. The execution of Order 66, the elimination of the Jedi Order in a single coordinated moment through the Clone Army's programming, was the result of years of planning that had begun before the Clone Wars started. The inhibitor chips in the clones, planted before they were even deployed, waiting for the signal, represent a kind of deep long-term planning that the Sith under the rule of two had been capable of for 1,000 years. Most of the Jedi never saw it coming because there was genuinely nothing to see. The threat was in people they trusted, and it had been there from the beginning. The declaration of the New Order, the moment when Palpatine transformed the Republic into the Empire, is one of the most politically interesting moments in Star Wars lore. He did not seize power